Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining. My name is Cari Jaquet, and I'm with P0 Security. On this Security Today webinar, we're going to be talking with Kelsey Brazill, who is going to share with us the framework for managing access in an age where we're dealing with cloud, with agents, with non-human identities, and what the identity stack needs to look like in this new world. First, a little bit about Kelsey. Welcome, Kelsey.
Thank you, Cari. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So Kelsey, as I said, is the head of product marketing at P0, and she has conversations every day with customers and prospects and partners about the identity stack and where it's going. So we're just going to do an informal fireplace kind of conversation with her as we go through some of the things that you're probably dealing with. So Kelsey, we've been to a lot of conferences, we've talked to a lot of folks, and it seems as though, like other parts of the cybersecurity world, when it comes to identity, people have spent a lot of money trying to solve the problems of whether it's for humans, non-humans. Many tools have been purchased to try and fill some gaps. What do you think has caused this massive explosion of tools for trying to either govern or manage identities?
Yeah, I think it's what this slide is visualizing for us right here. We're not in this world that we were in 20, 30 years ago where the act of managing access, especially to sensitive or privileged resources, like production environments, was super straightforward. It was, a few people that were VPNing into the perimeter and checking out, maybe a database password in from the vault, and then they'd get access, and it was all, static. It was really clean and easy to understand and manage. Fast forward to today, when even determining what's privileged is a far more complex equation than it used to be. You see on the left a sampling of the smattering of different resources that different enterprises have in their production environments. It could be any number combination of these things, all having, getting access to these systems is privileged in its own right. And then on the right hand side here, you see this is not just a few admin users that are looking to get access. It's different parts of your workforce. It's all of these NHIs all of a sudden. So machines, service accounts, service principals, workload IAMs, and then increasingly agents as well that are taking on more and more of the workload. So these factors all compound to have this kind of dizzying mess of access that we see in the middle here. And rightfully, it's hard to keep up with for organizations.
And so I'm a CISO. I'm looking at my landscape. I'm trying to figure out how to rationalize my tool set. How do you describe how I should be thinking about the next, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, I think what can really ground security leaders when they're trying to approach keeping pace with these types of environments, doing what they need to do, making sure that they're compliant, not only for security purposes, but for business purposes as well, customer acquisition, all of those kinds of things. It really boils down to these two core elements, which is authentication and authorization. And everything else that we showed on that earlier slide, all of the acronyms, those are really just capabilities that should fit within these core sections within these two categories. So we can break them down a little bit here. Authentication really just boils down to IAM. So this is like making sure you have SSO, making sure you have MFA. This most organizations have for more or less they've got this dialed in, which is great. It's super important and foundational. And then if you move into the authentication piece, which is, managing the access that we saw all over the place in the previous slide, there's kind of two categorizations here. There's IGA, which is really just that broad governance of all business applications and resources, typically owned by IT and GRC teams because it's more of like the operational, making sure people can get what they need to get to and that it's all documented and you can report back on it, et cetera, et cetera. And then as the system sensitivity increases, you get into the privileged access management space, which we have here as PAM. And this is, it could also be referred to as the production environment resources. And this gets more into the security operations platform, cloud sec teams that are really making sure that these crown jewels are protected and that only the people that need access have access to them. So beyond these three core things, like I said, we're really just talking about capabilities. And if you can figure out how to extend something like an NHI solution, for example, across all three of these areas, instead of making it its own pillar in its own right, you can have a more cohesive strategy. And that way it's easier to understand where your gaps lie and fill them accordingly. Maybe a tool, maybe an extension of something you already have, but try and keep it simple so that it's easier to understand where you need to, adjust or double down.
And I love the point about as you go up from, IGA, everybody can have access to whatever those systems are. But as you start to think about PAM or about production access management, if we don't want to say just privileged access management, there's, an increased sensitivity around that, around what that's protecting, right?
Right.
So that makes sense. So now when folks are thinking about where they are, where they want to be, what's keeping them stuck there. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we've put a ton of thought into this framework right here, and this is informed by thousands of customers, conversations, prospects, conversations, our leadership team and founding team's deep expertise in this space. Really, there's kind of these 6 stages of maturation, and we don't typically see enterprises on either end of these extremes, usually somewhere in the middle or a combination of the different foundations that we've laid out here. But really, it's just coming from that place down in the bottom left here of you don't have anything going on. You're just rolling out cloud. You're like, oh, we should hire a security person. This is what we're talking about down here. And again, like very rare that we see people here. But as the variety of environments increase, all the identities increase, there's a need to get closer and closer to this upper right-hand corner here, which is the utopia. You've got least privilege, continuous governance across every identity type. It's, running as part of the systems that are already in place, not as like an attachment or an inflection that's disrupting workflows, things like that. This is really like the mecca of where everybody wants to get to. And like I said, usually we're somewhere in between.
Got it. And I think we're going to break down each of the phases so that we'll talk more about zero touch production. I would also add that you may be in one phase when it comes to your human identities and in another, as you start to roll out agents or other things. So let's talk about it. You mentioned Wild Wild West. I think if folks are looking at this and they're like, wow, this sounds like where we are, then it's a good time to possibly look at modernizing before you go with like the standard tools that have been on the market for some time. You may want to think about what that should look like in the future so that you don't have to build later what you could plan on now, sort of future proof.
Sure. Yeah, I think this stage is even if you're here, you're not here long, if you're invested in security, just because this is basically like you've deprioritized it. So we have pretty much every problem that needs to be solved across the board here is still here. And the way we're breaking down each of these phases as we look in more detail is looking at user provisioning, looking at connectivity, looking at authentication, and then looking at authorization. So that's how we'll continue to break down these different stages and kind of give people a sense of you know, where they might fit if you find yourself maybe cringing or wincing a little bit more on certain slides than another, it might be an indicator that you're relating to the stage that we're diving into. But like I said, this is kind of starting at the bottom, and we can continue on as we start to progress and move through. So as enterprises really try and mature, especially around their cloud security, or often is the case hybrid, so they still have a lot of on-prem, but they're moving to the cloud. There's a few things that they take care of right away. So just establishing the basics. These are best practices that before you pass go, like you should be making sure that you have these things. So getting an identity provider in place, having some sort of VPN system for connectivity, SSA, MFA, SSO, and MFA, like we said, for user access. So that can also be done through Okta or Entra. And then increasingly, we start to see like vaults or some of these more like credential storage type of solutions come into place to try and protect sensitive resources. So this is usually bare minimum, and what folks try and get into place really quickly. But there's still a lot of challenges with this, and even some new ones that are introduced in the process. I think everyone that has leveraged VPNs can attest to how brittle they can be and the friction that's caused there. Um, and then with vaults, the static credentials really introduce standing access risk as well. And they're not necessarily rotated automatically. So they can just have that persistent access and be living um, until somebody, thinks to shut them down, or if they ever do. And then RBAC roles are manually governed. Like these things are all very intensive in terms of maintenance, and they introduce a lot of risk as well in terms of that persistent access that we talked about.
I also noticed this guy is wearing socks, not shoes, and that's, I think, also a telling sign if you're sitting at home
Yeah,
watching
don't give him
this with.
access.
Um, but but I think the other piece is if you're in this stage and then you're trying to do something like SOC 2 compliance, you're going to have some challenges because obviously the static, always on access is not going to pass go with that, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And the other challenge there with compliance is that the granularity you need in terms of really understanding the user that's responsible for the access as we start to introduce different kinds of identities and things like that, that gets really tricky too.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next one. But if anyone's feeling this, we feel you. Come talk to us. Okay.
Zero Trust Foundation. So I think Zero Trust in itself is pretty aspirational and almost philosophical. But what we're trying to talk to here is a lot of the movements or the technologies that we saw come into place during this time when Zero Trust was everywhere. The likes of Zscaler, Netscope, everybody got these types of solutions in place to help augment what they were already doing with VPNs or replace them entirely. Um, Connectivity becomes identity aware and centrally managed. So um, even if it's not entirely one-to-one to an individual user, there's some correlation that can happen and sense of who is doing what. So there's some improvement there in terms of visibility. Um, and then there is some, attack surface reduction over time at the network level, especially. But there's a new smattering of challenges that are emerging here as well. Um, as people move from vaults to more bastion and proxy based approaches to access management, You're getting shared accounts and still that standing access that isn't automatically deprovisioned or credentials that aren't being rotated. And you're still not at that app layer. So you're still operating at securing things at the network layer, and you don't have the granularity to the actual systems themselves to really manage what someone can do within these different resources that they have access to. So again, there's a ton of visibility gaps that persist, and you're missing that control that you need to really do this in a meaningful way, either for security or for governance. Least privilege. So this is where we start to see the introductions of the whizzes of the world at CSPM and SIEM tools that are used to right size user permission. So we're getting increased visibility. People are getting access, but it's much more critical in terms of how much access they need. Looking to remove unnecessarily over permissioned accounts. Um, and we're starting to get the introduction of just-in-time access. So making sure that people don't have that standing access. It's temporary, it's revoked after use, and really just doing as much as we can to minimize the amount of access that people have to really just what they need in order to do their jobs and do it well and efficiently. But this phase here, in terms of when we first start seeing companies adopt least privilege, it's so heavily focused on human users and employees. And that's a huge gap just in terms of, especially when we think about that chart of authorization where you move from IGA to PAM and that sensitivity goes up. The ways of working for developers increasingly is leveraging those NHIs, more and more so agents that do a huge part of the work for your developer organizations and modern environments. So not being able to see into those aspects of access is a huge risk. And often those users are still relying on static credentials and a lot of the things that we've solved for humans in this phase, but still remain unsolved for those other entities.
I'd add, and by the way, I pronounce it Kim, CIEM. I've always pronounced it wrong, but when I think about this, I'd also say this assumes that you've migrated 100% to cloud, that there's no on-prem there, or you've got other tools that are dealing with your on-prem identities or access to those on-prem environments. So I think that's another piece that, is problematic even at this stage, is when you're dealing with complex environments that don't just that aren't all cloud, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. So this is an extension of least privilege, focusing on NHI governance. So a lot of the same principles, but really just making sure that you're not leaving NHIs out to pasture in terms of governance. Because they still have access, they have privilege, and often it's standing and can be really dangerous, especially in those production sensitive systems. So this is really bringing all of access under one umbrella. So you have a single source of truth across NHIs, humans, and agents, making sure that you're rotating or replacing credentials so that you don't have that static credential proliferation that we see so often, especially for companies that are still using vaults. Um, and you're extending that fine-grained control so that you're actually able to operate at the app level where the work is actually happening instead of the network level where you don't have that same control. Um, and and this is something that I think in terms of the challenges that emerge, um, it's not that people don't know this is happening, it's that they don't know how to solve it, or it's really expensive to solve. So it can be a significant investment if you try and do this in-house in terms of engineering effort. It can cause drift, and there is a dance that you have to do in terms of ROI to justify like how much value is this gonna offer you if you don't have the automation to do it at scale.
Right. I mean, because this isn't, 50 agents or 150 agents. There are, cases we're seeing with thousands of agents being deployed daily, shutting down, turning back on, that sort of thing. So I think the scale piece is super important, especially when you're thinking about a do-it-yourself kind of model.
Yeah. I think that ephemeral nature that you touched on, Carrie, is really important to call out that I failed to too, is that these environments really do spin up and spin down. So the visibility piece and like just the tracking and even understanding what's what and what's out there can be a big hurdle for folks, much less managing it.
And if someone is embarking on either an NHI or an agent sort of initiative, it's much like back in the days when cloud transformation was happening. You don't want to wait till you're already doing it to discover that you haven't figured out how to handle the identities of these machines or these non-human identities. And so I think that's the other part is you can be here and you can have the initiative around this, getting agents doing some of the work, but foundationally, it's important to solve the identity, uh, thing that will become a crisis otherwise.
Okay, so this is Nirvana. This is when we said everything. Uh, Access is least privileged, it's short-lived, it's governed continuously. You don't have the issue of static credentials or standing access. You're provisioning access natively in target systems, so it's none of the bastions or jump posts. Like you're not bringing developers out of their ways of working to get them the access that they need. It's a lot of automation. It's a lot of cross-functional collaboration. But if all things are humming and you get to this end state, it's what we call zero touch production. And while it sounds wonderful and is, really the goal that we're all striving towards, there's definitely trade-offs to consider. Taking something on like this on in-house is extremely expensive and complex. I mean, we were talked about this a little bit with NHI least privilege, but that's, compounded. We're doing everything here and it's at scale and automated and integrated. Um, it's not practical for all environments, especially if you're almost entirely on-prem. This is really best for multi-cloud, cloud native, hybrid environments. And again, with the ROI, like just keeping an eye on how much you're investing in terms of like having your in-house teams take this on versus the security and the assurance that it's getting you for your larger security program.
Yeah, I think even in small companies, if you're heavy on the developer side, you're 40 people, but 25 of you are doing, some sort of engineering or dev work, it becomes, necessary because obviously that's, the most important thing to your company is what you're developing. So. Okay, so the summary of shifting to zero touch production, what is that? I think you sort of listed out some of these. It's a good reminder of like, where the journey can
Yeah.
can take you.
Yes, definitely. So this is touching on how P0 approaches zero touch production. So we are um, striving to basically get enterprises to a place where they can automate least privilege, audible, and agile access across all of these different user types. And the way that we do that is listed here on the right. First and foremost, just implementing short-lived just-in-time access wherever possible, and making sure that anything that you do in this realm is developer friendly. And as much as we like to say that it's about removing friction for them, it's also about just making sure that they adopt whatever security controls you're going to put in place. And that's a whole lot easier if you make it really seamless with their current ways of working, and integrate it with how they go about doing their production every day. Eliminating static credentials and standing privilege, also known here as zero standing privilege or static credentials. And then making sure that any provisioning that you're doing is tied back to the IDP as that source of truth in terms of who is actually doing the access. And that gives you that granularity, that auditability, and is something that is really ties together all of your other efforts here to make sure that you're able to do this in like a continuous and scalable way, because you're not introducing, a new directory or asking people to come into shared accounts. This is already the SSO that you've implemented and standardized a few steps ago, just leveraging that to layer on this access management.
So you mentioned P0 security. Let's talk about what our platform offers. I mean, you did a little bit there, and I think now it's really more about what are the use cases that our viewers might be wanting to solve. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think we mentioned in terms of the trade-offs of least privilege and of zero touch production is keeping an eye on ROI if you're trying to do this in-house. And the reason it's so expensive is because what you see P0 does for you in order to make this a reality. So if you think back to that chaos slide with all the resources and all of the information and all of the different types of access being requested by different entities, we take all of that information, and you'll see all the sensitive production resources listed on the left here. We centralize that, we digest it, and we pull out the inventory of all your identities, permissions, entitlements across. Yes, thank you, Cari. This broad set of production resources that might be on-prem, it might be in your cloud, it's developer tools, it's databases, containers, repositories. And we take that and we layer on top of it what we call our access graph. So this visualization of how all that comes together in order to create privileged access across your environment. So looking at the identity lineage, the patterns, the relationships, and this really just gives us the context that we need to solve some of these really critical use cases for our customers that we were talking through throughout our session today. So automating JIT access. How do you get the visibility that you need to inform least privilege policy and governance? Moving from on-prem and vaults and bastions to a more hybrid, modern PAM approach that's identity native. Ensuring audit readiness. If you need to gather evidence for SOC 2, we'll get you the session recordings that you need to do that, and it's in an on-demand fashion, so there's no scrambling. When your GRC team member calls you and says, I need this long list, you don't sacrifice days anymore. You can do it in a couple hours. And then increasingly, this NHI agentic sprawl, having that be part of your governance program, not a separate tool, just something that is another facet of how you really centralize control and management of access to your production environment. Oh, sorry, Cari, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say I'm most excited about the identity DNA layer because even if you're thinking about other projects in your identity stack and or you're thinking about projects related to how you're going to roll out machine identity security, it's important to start with a foundation that takes all of the data about what's happening with those resources, who's accessing it, why, when, et cetera, and put it all in a central, layer. And and I think that is one of the things we talk about the most is what has caused all of this confusion is the silos because IGA tools only look at data related to what they need to look at. And that, if each of those buckets is only looking at what they need to look at, then that's where you have gaps, right? So I think that's I don't know, I'm most excited about that.
Yeah, it's really powerful.
And now I don't know how to clear oh yeah, I do. Sorry, I take it back. I was going to say I don't know how to change and get rid of the board, but I do. And I apologize that I even second guessed myself. So I think we're about to come to a close. There are a couple of questions that came up, and I'll just end right now first saying, Kelsey, thank you so much for walking us through the phases. If this was interesting to you and you're like, I don't even know necessarily where we are. I think we're in a little bit of this, a little bit of that. We've got a field guide that gives you a pretty nice assessment you can do internally and just, talk amongst yourselves about where you think you are and what it's going to take for you to get to the next place. And we also have a trial. So if you're interested in just trying just-in-time access for a small group of your developers, or you want to play around with it and see if it even would meet your needs, reach out because we're happy to give you access to that with no obligation, no credit card required. And so thank you, Kelsey, for that. Do you want to close out real quick, or should I throw a couple of questions? I don't even know where we are on time, but maybe
Yeah,
just
questions would be great. I think closing thought here is just, and you mentioned it, Cari, when we kicked off, is, where you're at and where you want to go is highly dependent on the company itself. So like you can move up and down, you can go forward, you can also slip back, and maybe you have smatterings of different elements of this, but of course it's relative to the size of your company,
your
the size
developer team, your
developer
engine. Yeah.
team,
Mhm.
all your resources, your talent, all of that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
this is just a tool that we do in the interest of helping everyone get a sense of where they're at. And like Cari said, the trial is a great way to try on JIT for size and see if it's something that could help.
Yeah, perfect. Great. So here are a couple of questions. The first is we are halfway through our move to the cloud. Is it too late to be thinking about a new way of identities?
It's a great time. I think it's never too late to get control of this situation and to streamline it from a cost perspective, from an operational overhead perspective, and of course, most importantly, from a security perspective. Uh, the phases we walked through today was, I think, in our experience when we talk to customers, they're not proactively saying we're going to go, move to cloud and we're thinking about these problems. It's, they've done it and now they're looking back to like, okay, I have SSO, I have MFA, we have maybe some vaults or bastions, but we're still feeling this pain of the just access chaos that we saw earlier. So no, I think anytime's a good time to get it into place.
Okay, let's just do one more, but if the other questions are coming through, we'll respond directly to the audience members who sent them in. How do you compare to Apono? Or how are you different, I guess is maybe a better question.
Yeah, so for folks who aren't familiar with the Pono, they are a JIT tool that is focused on the cloud. So they offer a lot of the least privileged functionality that we talked through, and for folks that are looking for something, cloud native that they really just they want to do JIT. They have like a small use case. I think Apono is probably something worth looking at. We view this as a much bigger problem space. It's not just a single use case around just in time. It's this broader movement towards zero touch production that we've talked about. And the critical thing there is both the coverage in terms of entities that are getting access, the users, NHIs, and increasingly agents, but just as critically, it's the production coverage as well. that enterprise customer has hybrid environments. They're on-prem, they're in cloud, and they're really complex. And we believe that you should really bring that all together under our central control plane and simplify that for both your security teams operationally and also the developer experience too.
Okay, there's one more, and I'll address it head on just because I think it's a good question, and it must mean that you're doing some research. But how are you priced? Was the question. So just so that you're aware, we base it on developers or users, engineers, developers, et cetera. And so it's a monthly per user fee. For the just-in-time piece that that Kelsey's been talking about. There is an additional enterprise licensing model, but again, we can talk about that if that's what you're interested in, and provide you with more details, and that's a little bit more complex. But the just-in-time is pretty simple, easy to deploy. We've had a couple of customers literally walk through the trial on their own with some docs and built a pilot of folks that they wanted to try it out with, rolled it out. I think you had a conversation with Jeff from CommonLit a couple of weeks ago on another webinar. And ideal for replacing some homegrown tools and some, processes that were really cumbersome and complying with SOC 2. So if you're, feeling some of these issues, we'd love to chat. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, Kelsey. This was really, really great. And I look forward to another conversation. And thanks to this security team for allowing us to do this.
Thanks, Cari. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks.